This will be part 6 of my Outlander Season 7 Episode 12 review. As always, this will have spoilers for the books and the TV show, so if you are looking to avoid them, please do keep on scrolling. I filmed this last night, and as it was uploading, my phone overheated and TikTok deleted the draft, so I'm going to try and do my best to re-explain what I did last night and not leave anything out accidentally. At the end of my part 5 video, I talked a little bit about this scene and the importance of it, some of the changes that took place, but also kind of the overarching point of this conversation as it pertains to Jamie and Claire's relationship. So be sure to go watch that first. Now, the biggest change from the books is the location in which this conversation takes place. In the books, Jamie does not meet Claire back at Lord John's home. He actually meets her in a garden owned by a family called the Bartums, who Claire has been going to for herbs for her medicinal purposes at this point. While she's there, she's asked if she'd like to see the river path that they have and asks if they have arrowroot there. And so she is down there alone, gardening for the first time in a long time, and it's bringing her a lot of peace and comfort. And then she looks up because she senses Jamie's presence and she says, "Oh, there you are." While she's there, she actually has a conversation with the woman she's with, who is a Quaker, about Quaker marriages, and is thinking about how Dottie, who we haven't seen in the show, and Denzel could get married given that Dottie is not a Quaker, and likewise for Ian and Rachel. So there is some important conversation that takes place prior to Jamie appearing in front of her. In the show, obviously, they're in the house, and Jamie walks in and says that Mrs. Fig has left for the night, so they are alone in the house. That does not happen in the books. They sit on a bench in this garden to have this discussion. And I would say that almost every sentence in this conversation is pulled straight from the text, almost verbatim. But what we don't get in the show that I think is missing is the thoughts that we've had with Jamie in this whole time since he left with Lord John to now. And a lot of people, rightfully so, think that his anger is unfounded in a way, but I think that what this whole interaction is trying to showcase is how differently Claire and Jamie process their emotions and feelings, and how he really needs to hash it all out in the open with her and hear her side of things, because right now he only has one angle that he is approaching this conversation from, and until he gets the answers he needs, he cannot get out of that headspace. And part of that approach is that he needs all the details, and that's something that differs between him and Claire, because when he was apart from Claire, he actually had been thinking about Mary McNabb and his time with her in the cave. And so I think a lot of people who think that Jamie's being hypocritical about this because he did the same thing, in the books you get an entire section where he thinks about that and compares and contrasts the situation that he was going through versus Claire. So he does have that awareness within him when he's having this conversation with Claire. But the reason I think that his anger is so blinding is because of his relationship with Lord John Grey, and how Lord John picked at a scab that I think Jamie has long tried to heal, and unearthed a lot of emotions that were left over from his experience at Wentworth Prison. So Jamie is really firing everything he can accusatorily at Claire, and she needs to volley it back to him in order for him to get those thoughts out of his brain so that they don't fester there. And that's how their whole dynamic works in this scenario, is that Jamie just needs to fire every thought that he has at her and hear her counter it in order for him to make sense of things in his head. When Jamie told Claire that he had slept with Mary McNabb the first time, she didn't need all the details to wrap her head around it. And that, again, is where the two of them differ, but also showcases how well they know one another and how well they communicate, because they know what the other person needs. So Claire knows that Jamie is going to come in here, and fire all these questions at her in this way. She just would have waited, like she says, to feed him because she knew that this conversation was inevitable, just like Lord John did as well. Claire starts to make headway with Jamie as soon as she explains to him that she was in such a state that she was contemplating drinking an entire bottle of laudanum just to put an end to her feelings, and that John was the one that was the braver of the two and forced her to feel because she was trying to numb herself out from the world. And when Jamie hears that from her, that she would have rather ended her life than the alternative, which is what happened, that's when you see his face kind of soften, because for Jamie there's nothing worse for him to imagine than a world where Claire is not in it. And that's doubled down when Claire reiterates to Jamie that he would not be within his rights at all to do any wrongdoing towards John, because they thought he was dead. And I don't think it really gets through to Jamie how much that felt real to them until this moment when he hears it from Claire. And this push-pull that they go throughout this entire conversation is, again, just an example of how they work as a dynamic, because Jamie makes headway with her answers and then immediately throws something that's a worst case scenario in his brain, just so, again, she can volley it back at him and kind of dissuade him from that line of thinking so that he's able to push past all of these thoughts and negative feelings. At one point, Jamie says, "I know what you're like when you're drunk," to Claire, which she takes immediate offense to. And a line that they omitted in the show is that he said, she thinks with her body, and that's what makes her a great surgeon. And so Claire is able to kind of quickly understand what he was trying to say when he counters it with that. They, for some reason, didn't put that line in the show. And when he brings up Mary McNabb, he tries to explain to Claire how they can relate in this moment to that feeling of needing the comfort of another person. But for Jamie, the way that he handled it was so different, and Claire's was, as she explains, a lot more violent, and it wasn't sad and it wasn't tender. It was a lot of anger on her part. And so I think that's, again, another point where Jamie thinks that it should have been dealt with, or the feelings would have been in line with his, and they're different. So he has to understand why that is. What I loved about this passage was when Claire explains to Jamie that the word that Mary McNabb gave him was tenderness, but for her, she was trying to find a word for what Lord John gave her. And I love that that word ended up being triage, and that they were both open wounds that were just bleeding out emotionally, and Lord John was the braver of the two, and they pressed their wounds against one another in order to stop the bleeding. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for what happened, but also Jamie can relate to that as he explains that Lord John in many ways provided that for him as well when he was in Hellwater and William was born. Back in season 3, Jamie drew a very clear line in the sand with Lord John after Lord John, touched his arm to try and comfort him about Claire. And Lord John at the time was young, proud, and attracted to Jamie, and didn't realize that him touching him that way would trigger so much, as it stirred up so much feeling inside Jamie about what happened at Wentworth Prison. And Jamie made it very clear that their friendship would not have any of that, be a part of it. And John upheld that up until this point for Jamie. And so obviously that is where most of his anger is coming from. And in the books, Claire actually has a thought about how one of the pillars of their friendship was that John's attraction towards Jamie was never to be brought up. And so she understands that if that pillar was kicked out, he would have a reaction like this. There are 2 quotes in this passage that I always highlight in the book, and that is when Jamie tells Claire that he's loved her since he saw her, and also this one where he says, "I will not say that I don't mind this, because I do, and I will make a fuss about it later. I know I will." But it summarizes how they have to work through their hardships in this way, similar to how they did in the earlier seasons when they both faced a challenge head on and were learning how to communicate with one another. Jamie asks Claire, "Are you still my wife?" And she says, "How could I not be?" But a lot of people have pointed this out in the comments. There has been no verbal confirmation from Claire or Lord John that she was married to Lord John yet in the show. And so while these two reacquaint themselves with one another, in the books it's in a potting shed. Here, obviously, it's on the dining room table. We end the episode seeing Lord John escaping from his shackles and running through the woods away from the British Army. And the poor guy, Jamie comes back and his whole world implodes, and we will continue to see that in the following episodes.